Before Baghdad was spoken aloud, before streets claimed memory, women carried the city quietly. Around 410 AD, their lives were arranged, not celebrated, measured in endurance rather than names. This story does not chase heroes or empires. It listens to the unnoticed labor that allowed a city, unnamed and ungrateful, to exist at all, long before history bothered to look. If these quiet stories of the past help your breathing slow and your thoughts soften into the night, you are always welcome to remain here. We would be grateful for your subscription as it quietly supports long-form storytelling without noise, urgency, or performance. It helps protect this calm space where history moves at its own pace and speaks in a low voice. Your presence allows more evenings like this to exist, more patience, more stillness, more careful listening. There is no rush. Return whenever the world feels too loud. We will be here, quietly waiting. If this quiet hour feels comfortable, you're welcome to stay. We hope you will choose to subscribe, helping these calm nights continue, one story at a time. No rush, no noise, just history moving slowly together. The fate of women in the ancient city of Baghdad in the medieval period, 410 AD. When the city still had no name, women, the unrecorded foundations of a city. Women were not born to choose. Around the year 410 AD, in the low, quiet lands between rivers that would one day be called Baghdad, life did not arrive with ceremony. There was no sense of destiny unfolding, no awareness that history might someday pass through and leave a name behind. The land was functional. The water moved. The fields responded to effort. The settlements existed because people kept them going, and women from the beginning were placed gently but firmly inside that continuation. A woman did not enter the world as a question. She entered as an answer already assumed. Not who will she become, but where will she fit? The difference mattered, though no one paused to explain it. Explanation was unnecessary. The rhythm of life handled that part on its own. From the moment a girl could stand steadily, she was already useful. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that required praise. Useful in the quieter sense that keeps households breathing, carrying water without spilling too much, watching younger children without complaint, learning which tasks required patience and which required speed. No one framed this as destiny. It was simply the way things were arranged, like walls placed where shade was needed, like paths worn where feet passed most often. Society did not require women to be exceptional. Exceptionality creates noise. It draws attention. It disrupts schedules. What was needed instead was reliability, a body that woke up each morning and did what was required without renegotiation, hands that repeated motions until those motions no longer needed thought, a presence that made life easier by being predictable. In a world that already demanded effort from everyone, predictability was a gift. History much later would search for turning points, for moments when something changed, but women's lives were rarely designed for change. They were designed for continuation, for ensuring that one day flowed into the next with as little friction as possible. This did not make their lives small. It made them structurally important in a way history rarely knows how to describe. No one wrote down their names because nothing about their labor demanded interruption. Fires stayed lit. Food appeared when expected. Cloth was repaired before it failed completely. Children survived childhood. Elders were fed. Life continued. And when life continues smoothly, history tends to look elsewhere. From the outside, it might appear that women were invisible. From the inside, they were unavoidable. The household did not function without them. The rhythm of daily life did not hold. The economy, such as it was, would stumble quickly. But invisibility and indispensability are not opposites. They often arrive together. Women were not asked what they wanted because wanting suggested instability. Desire implied the possibility of change, and change required resources, time, energy, risk. Most communities living close to survival did not indulge risk lightly, so instead, they organized life to minimize it. Women were placed at the center of that strategy, not as decision makers, but as stabilizers. This was not cruelty in the theatrical sense. There were no villains rubbing their hands together in the dark. There was only a system that favored what worked, and what worked was repetition. What worked was consistency. What worked was a social structure in which most people accepted the shape of their lives early and adjusted their expectations accordingly. A woman's life unfolded in predictable stages, though no one labeled them. Childhood blended quietly into usefulness. Usefulness blended into responsibility. Responsibility blended into management. Management blended into endurance. Endurance blended into age. At no point did the system ask for reflection. Reflection slows things down. If a woman felt dissatisfaction, there was little language for it. Not because she lacked inner life, but because inner life had no obvious outlet. There were no institutions designed to receive it, no spaces reserved for reconsideration. The world rewarded completion, not contemplation. And so women learned to be skilled, not only with their hands, but with their expectations. They learned which hopes were practical and which were better set aside gently, like objects that might be needed later but had no place on the table right now. This was not resignation. It was calibration. There is a certain irony here, though it rarely gets acknowledged. The very qualities that made women essential, patience, repetition, quiet competence, also made them historically forgettable. You cannot point to a single moment and say, here is where she mattered, because she mattered everywhere, all the time, without interruption. History prefers moments of rupture. It prefers collapse, conquest, reform. It prefers men who break things and then announce it loudly. Women, in contrast, specialized in preventing collapse before it became visible. They managed decline gently. They absorbed strain quietly. They redistributed effort without calling attention to the fact that they were doing so. In a sense, women were the infrastructure. And like most infrastructure, they were only noticed when something went wrong. This does not mean women were passive. Passivity suggests absence of action. In reality, women were constantly acting. They adjusted, negotiated, compensated, and adapted. They made thousands of small decisions each day, none of which were dramatic enough to enter chronicles, but all of which shaped how long a household, a settlement, or a way of life could endure. They knew how to stretch resources, how to wait, how to endure discomfort without turning it into crisis. These were not romantic skills. They were survival skills. And survival, unlike heroism, rarely gets applause. It is tempting from a modern distance to frame this as oppression alone, and certainly choice was limited. But reduction oversimplifies what was actually a complex negotiation between necessity and possibility. Women were constrained, yes, but they were also trusted with the most delicate task any society faces, keeping life from unraveling. That trust did not come with autonomy. It came with expectation. Heavy expectation. The kind that does not ask whether you are tired. The kind that assumes you will manage anyway. From the beginning, a woman's life was tied not to transformation but to preservation, not to ambition but to maintenance, not to memory but to continuity. If the world did not collapse, she had done her job, and if it did collapse, history would likely blame something else. This is perhaps the quietest irony of all. Women carried responsibility without credit, effort without acknowledgement, and endurance without recognition. And they did so not because they were invisible to those around them, but because visibility itself was a liability. To be seen too clearly was to invite disruption, and disruption was expensive. So women learned to disappear just enough, to blend into routine, to let their labor speak through results rather than words. They became experts at sustaining systems that did not thank them, because gratitude was not part of the structure. In the long evenings, after the work slowed and the air cooled slightly, there may have been moments of rest. Not rest in the modern sense, but a pause. A chance to sit without moving for a few breaths longer than necessary. In those moments, thoughts might drift, not toward revolution, but toward small adjustments. How tomorrow could be slightly easier. How effort might be redistributed. How pain could be managed quietly. These thoughts did not challenge the order. They worked within it. And because of that, they survived. The city that would one day be named did not yet know it would need monuments or libraries or grand avenues. What it needed first was continuity. And continuity requires people willing to repeat what works without demanding recognition for it. Women filled that role so thoroughly that it became naturalized. Their labor blended into the background noise of existence, or rather, the background silence. When later generations looked back, they would see the outlines of a city forming, trade routes, markets, administrative structures. They would speak of development, of growth, of civilization emerging from the riverbanks. What they would not see unless they listened very carefully was the quiet labor that made such emergence possible. The lives lived not as stories, but as systems. Women were not born to choose, they were born to fit. And by fitting so well, they became the unseen foundation of everything that followed. If this sounds heavy, it is meant to be light, not because the subject lacks weight, but because the people living it did not have the luxury of dramatizing it. They lived gently within constraints. They adapted without announcing it. They slept when they could. They laughed when it did not cost too much energy. They endured because endurance was easier than resistance. And so tonight, as we begin this story, we do not look for rebellion or tragedy. We listen instead to the sound of life continuing, softly, repeatedly, without asking to be remembered. This is where the city truly begins. A woman did not arrive in the world as a blank space. She arrived as a solution. Long before she understood language, the structure around her had already decided where she would be useful, not where she would shine, not where she would explore, where she would hold things together. The difference was subtle but permanent. In these early settlements, life did not reward imagination. Imagination required surplus, and surplus was rare. What life rewarded instead was repetition. Doing the same necessary thing again and again and again, without complaint and without delay. Women learned this rhythm early. Not because anyone sat them down to explain it, but because the rhythm was everywhere. It moved through the household like air, unnoticed until it stopped. A girl learned by watching. There were no formal lessons, no clear beginnings. She absorbed information the way one absorbs heat at the end of a long day. Gradually, without realizing it was happening, she learned which vessels were too fragile to trust to children, which tasks could be delayed, which could not, which mistakes were tolerated, and which quietly followed you for years. No one framed this as destiny. Destiny implies drama. This was closer to logistics. Women appeared in daily life as expected presences. When something needed to be done, they were already nearby. When something went wrong, they noticed first. Not because they were naturally attentive, but because the structure placed them close to the fragile parts of life. Food, water, children, aging bodies. These things fail slowly, and they require someone who notices small changes before they become problems. Society did not need women to be brilliant. Brilliance interrupts routines. It draws attention inward. What was needed was steadiness. A person who did not require constant supervision, someone who would notice when supplies ran low and adjust quietly without turning scarcity into panic. And so women were shaped into that role, not through force, but through expectation. Expectation can be heavier than force. It sits gently on the shoulders and stays there. From the beginning, a woman's value was measured not by what she achieved, but by how little disruption followed her presence. A well-lived day was one where nothing collapsed. A successful life was one where continuity was maintained. If people ate, slept, and woke to repeat the cycle again, then everything was considered in order. History much later would call this stagnation, but stagnation is a judgment made from a distance. Up close, it felt like survival arranged with care. Women were not encouraged to imagine alternatives, not because imagination was forbidden, but because alternatives were impractical. To imagine another life required time to sit and think. To sit and think required someone else to keep the world moving. And the world at that point did not have spare hands. So women learned to think while working, to reflect in fragments, to hold ideas loosely, like objects that might be set down at any moment if something more urgent appeared. This shaped not only their days, but their inner lives. Thoughts became practical. Hopes became adjustable. Disappointment learned to be quiet. If a woman wondered what her life might have been elsewhere, there was rarely space to linger on the question. Water still needed carrying, meals still needed preparing. The body learned to return quickly to the present because the present demanded attention. There is a strange calm in this arrangement, though it rarely gets acknowledged. When expectations are fixed early, the future loses some of its sharp edges. Uncertainty becomes manageable. Pain becomes predictable. Even exhaustion has a rhythm. This does not mean women did not suffer. It means suffering was integrated into daily life rather than treated as an emergency. It was handled the way heat or dust was handled, acknowledged, adapted to, and worked around. From the outside, this might look like acceptance. From the inside, it was more like negotiation, constant, quiet negotiation with circumstances that were unlikely to change. And so, from the very beginning, women's lives were bound to the idea of fitting. Not fitting in socially, but fitting structurally, becoming the piece that made everything else align. They were not asked to move the world forward. They were asked to keep it from slipping backward. And in a time when even small failures could cascade into disaster, that task was not minor. It was essential, just not memorable. This is how women entered history before history noticed them, as solutions, as stabilizers, as the reason life could afford to continue without pause. And because nothing dramatic happened, the world considered this normal. If ban muon, buok tiep theo min si, they were not asked to move the world forward. They were asked to keep it from slipping backward. And that request, though rarely spoken aloud, shaped everything. A woman's day did not unfold as a story, it unfolded as a sequence, one task easing into the next, without punctuation. Morning did not begin with intention, only with need. Evening did not arrive as rest, only as a softer version of work. Even sleep was practical, taken seriously because tired bodies made mistakes, and mistakes were expensive. In this world, effort was not dramatic, it was continuous, and women became experts in continuity. They learned how much energy could be spent without breaking tomorrow, how to slow down just enough to last, how to carry fatigue the way one carries water, carefully, without spilling too much. Society did not celebrate this skill, but it depended on it completely. A woman did not need to be visible to be valued. In fact, visibility often created risk. To be noticed was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny rarely improved one's situation. Safety lay in being necessary, but unremarkable. Present, but not loud. Reliable, but not demanding. There is a quiet humor in this, though it rarely reads that way in textbooks. The people who did the most to keep the world running were the least likely to be recorded. History, it turns out, prefers inefficiency. It remembers moments when systems failed loudly enough to require explanation. Smooth operation, on the other hand, disappears into the background. Women learn to live in that background. Not unhappily, necessarily, just attentively. Their satisfaction, when it came, was modest. A day without conflict. A task completed on time. A household that made it through another season without loss. These were not small victories in a fragile world. They were everything. If a woman laughed, it was often quietly at things no one else noticed. The absurdity of repeating the same action for decades. The irony of being indispensable and forgettable at the same time. The strange comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow would demand, even if it demanded too much. There was no expectation that life would improve. Improvement was a dangerous idea. It suggested change, and change introduced uncertainty. Instead, the goal was balance, to keep things within tolerable limits, to prevent decline from becoming collapse. And women were very good at this. They adjusted meals when supplies thinned. They redistributed effort when bodies weakened. They compensated for absence without mentioning it. They filled gaps quietly so that no one had to stop and acknowledge the gap existed. This was not heroism, it was maintenance. And maintenance, while deeply unglamorous, is the reason anything lasts long enough to be admired later. Long before the city acquired walls, names, or reputation, it required this kind of labor. Labor that did not announce itself. Labor that blended into routine. Labor that allowed everyone else to imagine they were living in a stable world. Women made that illusion possible. They did not experience their lives as foundations. Foundations are concepts invented afterward. They experienced their lives as sequences of necessary actions performed well enough to avoid trouble, and in doing so, they gave the future something solid to stand on. When historians eventually arrive, they will bring language, periods, labels, timelines. They will speak of transformation, development, emergence. They will mark beginnings and ends. But before any of that, there were women who lived without knowing they were at the beginning of anything. They were not preparing for a city. They were preparing for tomorrow. And tomorrow, as it turned out, was enough. This is where our story rests for a moment. Not on an event, not on a turning point, but on a condition. A quiet, stable arrangement of lives that did not ask to be remembered, only to continue. When the city still had no name, women already knew their role. They fit. And because they fit so well, the world held together long enough for history to eventually notice there was something worth naming. Before Baghdad became a city that history could recognize, it was simply a place where life had to keep going. Around the year 410 AD, there were no grand names, no reputation to protect, no sense that the ground beneath these settlements would one day matter to anyone beyond the people who lived on it. What existed instead was routine. Water drawn, food prepared, children watched, bodies rested just enough to work again, and at the center of this quiet continuity were women. This story is not about famous figures or dramatic turning points. It is about how a city survives before it knows it will become one. Women did not enter this world as individuals invited to choose their paths. They entered as parts of a structure already in motion. Their lives were shaped less by aspiration than by placement. From the beginning, they were expected to fit into roles that ensured stability, not transformation. Society did not require women to be exceptional. Exceptionality disrupts rhythm. What was needed was steadiness, repetition, the ability to perform the same necessary actions day after day without asking to be noticed. History would later celebrate expansion and innovation, but long before that, survival depended on people willing to maintain what already existed. Women carried that responsibility quietly. Their labor did not announce itself. It blended into the background of daily life so thoroughly that it appeared natural, almost invisible. Meals arrived when they should. Homes remained functional. Children grew old enough to repeat the cycle. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was precisely the point. Stability in fragile conditions is an achievement that rarely looks impressive from a distance. This introduction asks us to slow down and look at what usually goes unrecorded. Not suffering alone and not heroism either, but endurance. The kind of endurance that does not seek recognition because recognition would require interruption. Women's lives were tied to continuation, not change. They were measured by how smoothly life moved around them, not by how loudly they altered its direction. Before Baghdad had walls, before it had a name, it rested on this quiet labor. Women were not building a city in the way history prefers to describe. They were making sure there would still be something there for history to arrive at later. That is the foundation this story listens for. Women entered life with roles already assigned. Women did not enter life the way doors open. They entered the way furniture already sits in a room. By the time a girl could notice herself as a separate presence, the shape of her life had already been adjusted around her. Not with cruelty, not with urgency, simply with the quiet confidence of people who believed the arrangement made sense. There was a place for her, it had been there all along, and the world expected her to step into it without hesitation, the way one steps into a familiar rhythm without asking who set the tempo. No one asked who she would become. That question belonged to another kind of world, one with extra time and spare resources. Here, the more useful question was what she would do, and when she could begin. The day had needs, the household had gaps, the future required maintenance. Identity, while interesting, did not help carry water or keep food from spoiling. And so, before she learned language, before she learned names for feelings or desires, she learned placement. Where to stand without blocking movement. When to speak without interrupting. How to move quietly enough that nothing had to stop because of her. This learning did not feel like instruction. It felt like atmosphere, like heat, like gravity, something always present, shaping behavior without needing explanation. A girl did not wake up one morning and discover her role. It unfolded gradually, the way evening arrives. One task became expected, then another. Soon the absence of her effort felt heavier than its presence. If she did not help, something slowed. If she was late, someone noticed. If she failed, the failure did not announce itself loudly, but it lingered, inconvenient and uncomfortable. This was how usefulness was taught, not through praise, but through dependence. Families did not frame this as limitation. They framed it as preparation. The world, after all, was not designed to accommodate indecision. Survival required coordination. Every member needed to contribute in a predictable way. And women from an early age were trained to be predictable in the most necessary places. Their roles were not chosen because they were feminine. They were chosen because they were close to the fragile parts of life. Food, water, children, time. These things break quietly. They require attention that does not wander. Someone had to stay near them, and that someone, almost without discussion, was a woman. This arrangement carried a certain calm. When expectations are fixed early, uncertainty loses its sharp edge. There is comfort in knowing what will be required tomorrow, even if it is tiring. There is safety in a life that does not surprise you too often. And women learn to live inside that safety, adjusting themselves just enough to remain useful without drawing attention. They were not expected to excel. Excellence disrupts systems. It introduces imbalance. What mattered instead was reliability, doing the same necessary things well enough, often enough, that life could continue without pause. This kind of competence rarely produces stories, but it produces stability, and stability is what fragile societies depend on most. A woman's life was not treated as a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. It was treated as a sequence of functions. Each stage prepared her for the next. Childhood softened into usefulness. Usefulness settled into responsibility. Responsibility aged into management. There was no moment where the structure paused to ask if she agreed with the progression. Agreement was assumed. Her fate was not personal. It was logistical. This does not mean her inner life was empty. It means her inner life learned restraint. Thoughts learned to travel quietly. Desires learned to lower their voices. Reflection happened in fragments, often while the body was already engaged in something else. There was no dedicated space for imagining alternatives because alternatives required disruption, and disruption was expensive. Desire, when it appeared, learned to negotiate. It learned to wait until the household was calm, the day complete, the work finished. And even then, it rarely demanded anything. It adjusted itself to what was possible, the way water adjusts to the shape of a vessel. There is a soft irony here. Women were trusted with enormous responsibility, yet rarely trusted with direction. They were expected to manage complexity, but not to redefine it. Their judgment was relied upon, as long as it served continuity rather than change. This arrangement was not enforced through constant control. It persisted because it worked. When women fit well into their assigned roles, life moved smoothly. Meals appeared, children grew, aging relatives were cared for. Nothing collapsed. And when nothing collapses, systems tend to persist without questioning themselves. History would later describe this period as static, but static is a word used by observers, not participants. From within, life was dynamic in small, careful ways. Adjustments were constant. Nothing stayed exactly the same, but change happened slowly, absorbed into routine rather than announced. Women became skilled at this kind of movement. They learned how to shift effort without calling attention to the shift, how to compensate for absence without naming it, how to stretch resources without dramatizing scarcity. These were not glamorous skills, they were practical, and they were essential. A woman who fit well did not need to speak often. Her presence was felt through absence of problems. Things simply worked better around her. This was considered success. No recognition was required. Recognition would have been awkward. It would have implied that something unusual was happening, when in fact the goal was to make everything feel normal. Normality in a fragile world is an achievement. Over time, this sense of fitting became internalized. Women learned not only what was expected of them, but how to expect it of themselves. Desire softened, ambition narrowed. Not because they were incapable of wanting more, but because wanting more required energy better spent elsewhere. There is a gentle humor in how thoroughly this logic settled in. Women carried the weight of entire households, yet rarely questioned why they were tired. Fatigue became part of the landscape, something you navigated like heat or dust. Complaining did not cool the air, so effort learned to pace itself instead. This did not erase individuality, it reshaped it. Personality expressed itself through method rather than direction, through how a task was done, not whether it was chosen. One woman was known for patience, another for speed, another for noticing small details. These differences mattered, even if they never made it into records. Fate, in this sense, was not a dramatic force pressing down from above. It was a set of expectations repeated so consistently that alternatives slowly faded from view. Not forbidden, just unnecessary. A woman's success was measured by how little disruption followed her. A good day was one where nothing went wrong. A good life was one where problems were handled quietly, before anyone else had to notice them. If the household continued without interruption, she had done well. And so women entered life not as open possibilities, but as carefully placed supports. They were not invited to imagine the future. They were invited to maintain it. This did not feel tragic in daily life. Tragedy requires contrast, and contrast was rare. Life unfolded as it always had. The rhythm was familiar, the expectations clear. There was comfort in that clarity, even when it was heavy. If a woman wondered what might exist beyond her assigned role, the thought usually passed quickly. There was always something more immediate to attend to. The present had weight. The future could wait. And perhaps this is why history struggles to see them. History looks for moments of declaration, of rupture, of change. Women specialized in preventing rupture, in smoothing edges, in absorbing strain. Their labor erased the very evidence that something had almost gone wrong. They were not heroes. They were something quieter, something more durable. They were the reason the world could afford to remain calm enough for history to eventually arrive and give things names. And in that unnamed time, when no one imagined a city would one day stand here, women were already in place, already working, already fitting. Not because they had chosen this life, but because the life had been arranged gently and firmly around them. And fitting in that world was the most valuable skill of all. And once fitting became a habit, it stopped feeling like a decision. A woman did not wake each morning questioning her place. Questioning required distance, and distance was a luxury. Her place was confirmed by routine, by the familiar weight of tasks waiting without being named, by the way the day moved forward only after she did. Life rarely paused long enough to invite reflection, and so reflection learned to travel quietly, like a thought carried while hands were busy. There was a particular kind of calm in this predictability. Not joy exactly, but steadiness. The comfort of knowing what would be asked of you, even if what was asked was too much. Uncertainty, after all, exhausts the mind. Certainty, even when heavy, can be carried more easily. Women became experts in carrying. They carried work across hours without dividing it into milestones. They carried responsibility without announcing it. They carried fatigue without letting it interrupt the rhythm of the household. This was not because they were endlessly patient. It was because impatience rarely changed outcomes, and conserving energy mattered. Families relied on this quiet endurance more than they admitted. The structure held because women absorbed its pressure. When something went wrong, it was often noticed, first by them, corrected by them, and forgotten by everyone else. The correction mattered more than the recognition. A woman's life did not ask for meaning. It asked for reliability. This is why wanting became complicated. Wanting implied preference, and preference implied deviation. To want something different was to imagine a version of the world that required rearrangement. Rearrangement demanded time, negotiation, and often conflict. In a world balanced carefully on repetition, conflict felt dangerous. So, desire learned to soften its edges. It did not disappear. It adjusted. It learned to exist as a quiet background presence rather than a demand. Wanting something small felt safer than wanting something transformative. A slightly easier day. A moment of rest. A task completed early. These were desires that fit inside the existing structure without threatening it. Women became skilled at this internal negotiation. They learned how to lower expectations without losing dignity, how to adapt hopes to circumstances without feeling completely erased. This skill was not taught explicitly. It was learned through observation and necessity, the way most survival skills are. From the outside, this adaptability might look like acceptance. From the inside, it felt more like balance. A constant adjustment to keep life within tolerable limits. And there was, undeniably, a quiet humor in it. Women were expected to manage households, schedules, resources, and relationships, yet were rarely trusted with deciding the direction of their own lives. They held everything together, while being told, indirectly, that they should not move anything. It is the kind of irony that does not provoke laughter. It provokes a small, inward smile, the kind that comes from understanding the rules of a game too well to protest them loudly. A woman who understood her assigned role deeply could move within it with surprising skill. She knew when to speed up and when to slow down, when to intervene and when to wait, when silence would be safer than speech. These were not signs of weakness, they were signs of expertise. The system depended on this expertise, even as it refused to name it. As years passed, the role did not feel imposed. It felt inherited. Something passed down through example rather than instruction. Younger women watched older ones and learned not only what to do, but how to endure doing it, how to maintain composure, how to preserve energy, how to laugh quietly at the absurdity of repetition without letting that laughter become disruptive. This was not a life designed for recognition. It was a life designed for function. And function, when performed well, disappears into the background. Women learn to accept that disappearance. Not because they believed themselves unworthy of notice, but because attention rarely brought relief. Being seen often came with expectation, scrutiny, or correction. Remaining slightly unseen allowed a measure of autonomy within constraint, a small space to adjust, to manage, to survive on one's own terms. So fitting was not only obedience, it was strategy. By fitting well, women gained room to maneuver within the narrow boundaries available to them. By not standing out, they avoided becoming problems that needed solving. By keeping life smooth, they earned a quiet authority that did not require official acknowledgement. This authority was subtle. It did not issue commands. It operated through familiarity, through knowing how things were done and why changing them would be costly. Others deferred to it without naming the deference. And so the role assigned at the beginning of life became something women inhabited fully, not because it was chosen, but because it was understood. The world made sense inside it. There was order, there was rhythm, there was a predictable exchange between effort and outcome. This predictability did not make life easy, but it made it navigable. And in a time when survival depended on navigation more than ambition, that was enough. By the time a woman reached maturity, the idea of an unassigned life felt distant. Not forbidden, simply irrelevant. The structure had shaped not only her days, but her sense of what was possible. Fitting no longer felt like constraint. It felt like gravity. Something you move with, not against. This is how women entered life with roles already assigned, and how those roles settled quietly into being called normal, not just by the world around them, but eventually by themselves. Over time, fitting became less an action and more a condition. A woman did not think of herself as someone fulfilling a role. She thought of herself as someone living normally. The role dissolved into the background of her days, the way breathing does. You notice it only when it becomes difficult. As long as it worked, it required no reflection. This was how expectations became internal. No one needed to enforce them anymore. The structure had already done its work. A woman knew when to step forward and when to remain still. She sensed the limits of what could be asked and what should not be. She learned the subtle art of doing just enough and never too much. Too much effort raised questions. Too much visibility attracted attention. And attention, in a fragile system, rarely brought comfort. So women refined a careful balance. They worked efficiently but quietly. They solved problems before they became noticeable. They absorbed strain in ways that left no marks. This was not because they lacked feeling. It was because feeling had to coexist with function. If a woman felt tired, she adjusted her pace. If she felt resentment, she folded it inward until it softened. If she felt ambition, she redirected it toward making daily life smoother rather than larger. These were not acts of surrender, they were acts of calculation. In a world that rewarded continuity, calculation was wisdom. There was a certain peace in this arrangement, though it was never named as such. The peace of knowing where you belonged. The peace of not having to explain yourself. The peace of predictability. It did not eliminate hardship, but it framed it. Hardship became expected, and expectation, strangely, made it easier to carry. Women developed an intimate understanding of time, not time as measured by events, but time as measured by repetition. Seasons mattered more than years. Tasks mattered more than milestones. Life moved in cycles rather than arcs, and women learned how to move with those cycles instead of resisting them. Resistance required energy better saved for tomorrow. And so the idea of wanting something else slowly lost its sharpness. Not because women stopped imagining, but because imagination learned to adapt itself to what could be sustained. Dreams did not vanish. They became quieter, more practical, less interested in changing the world, more interested in surviving it with some measure of calm. This quiet adjustment did not make women insignificant. It made them structurally essential. The system leaned on their steadiness even as it pretended that steadiness required no effort. Their labor created the illusion that life was simply unfolding as it should. Illusions, when stable, are powerful. By the time a woman reached the middle of her life, her role felt less like something assigned and more like something inherited, not imposed from above, but passed along through observation and habit. Younger women watched older ones and absorbed not only what they did, but how they endured doing it, how they conserved energy, how they avoided unnecessary conflict, how they accepted limits without turning acceptance into defeat. This knowledge was never written down. It did not need to be. It lived in gestures, timing, and tone, in knowing when to speak and when to let silence finish the work, in understanding that some things could be changed slowly and others could not be changed at all. Within this understanding, women found a narrow but real form of agency. Not the freedom to choose their path, but the freedom to navigate the path they had been given with skill, to make it smoother, safer, more bearable for themselves and for those around them. And that quietly became enough. A woman's life did not announce itself as meaningful. It proved itself through endurance, through the simple fact that things continued, that children grew, that households did not collapse, that the day arrived, was managed, and gave way to night without incident. This was the success the system recognized, even if it never said so aloud. So women entered life with roles already assigned and learned to inhabit those roles so completely that they became invisible, not erased, but blended. Part of the structure itself, they were not meant to stand out. They were meant to hold things in place. And they did. Girlhood ended when the body became useful. In the early medieval world, childhood was not a protected season. It was a brief pause before usefulness. There was no clear line separating a girl from a woman. No moment when someone stepped forward and declared that childhood had ended. The transition happened quietly, almost politely, as if the world did not wish to draw attention to what it was doing. One day, a girl was small. Another day, she could lift something without dropping it, and that was enough. In communities living close to survival, age was measured less by years and more by capacity. If a body could work, it worked. If it could carry, it carried. If it could endure long hours without collapsing, it was no longer considered a child. This was not harshness in the theatrical sense. It was arithmetic. Bodies that could contribute were counted. Bodies that could not were protected briefly, then gently nudged forward. Girlhood did not end with ceremony. It ended with expectation. No one needed to say it aloud. The tasks simply arrived. A little heavier than before, a little more frequent, a little less forgiving. The girl adjusted because adjustment was the only available response. Resistance required language, and language came later. Fatigue arrived first. In the medieval household, learning was practical. A girl did not study in order to expand her mind. She learned in order to prevent mistakes. Which container cracked in heat? Which grain spoiled fastest? How long something could be left unattended before it became a problem? Knowledge was not abstract. It was tactile. It lived in the hands. Curiosity was not discouraged. It was redirected. Asking why something was done mattered less than knowing how to do it correctly. There was little patience for questions that did not lead directly to improvement. Thought was valuable only when it shortened effort or reduced risk. And so learning happened quickly, efficiently, without nostalgia. A girl learned while working and worked while learning until the two became indistinguishable. There was no protected time for exploration, no space reserved for innocence. Innocence, after all, did not keep households running. Competence did. This is why childhood memories for many women were brief and indistinct, not because nothing happened, but because nothing lingered. Each stage replaced the one before it without pause. There was no invitation to look back. The world leaned forward and the body followed. Play existed, but only in the margins, in stolen moments, in laughter that did not interfere with work. Play was tolerated as long as it did not slow the rhythm of the day. When it did, it was quietly set aside. A girl learned early that usefulness brought safety. The more capable she became, the less fragile her position felt. Fragility belonged to those who depended too heavily on others. Capability created a kind of protection, even if it came at the cost of childhood. In the medieval imagination, this transition was not mourned. There was no concept of something being lost. What mattered was readiness. A ready body, a ready pair of hands. A mind alert enough to notice problems before they became expensive. And so girlhood faded without grief. This did not mean girls did not feel the change. They felt it in their muscles, in the lengthening of days, in the way expectations settled onto them more firmly. They learned to move differently, to rest less, to carry themselves with a seriousness that did not come from wisdom, but from necessity. Adults did not sit them down to explain this seriousness. Explanation was unnecessary. The structure taught it well enough on its own. There is a quiet irony here. Childhood is often remembered as something precious, something to be preserved. But preservation requires resources, time, space, surplus. In the early medieval world, surplus was rare. What existed instead was urgency disguised as normality. Girls adapted to that normality quickly. Their bodies learned endurance before their minds learned possibility. Their attention sharpened around tasks rather than dreams. This shaped not only what they did, but how they remembered. Memory favors moments of pause. When life does not pause, memory shortens. And so childhood became a faint impression rather than a chapter. A soft blur at the beginning of life, quickly overtaken by responsibility. By the time a girl was considered grown, there was little sense of crossing a threshold. She'd already been living on the other side of it for some time. The world did not change when childhood ended. It simply continued as it always had. In this way, girlhood was not taken from women. It was absorbed, folded quietly into usefulness. And usefulness, in a medieval world, was the closest thing to adulthood that existed. They did not grow up by becoming different people. They grew up by becoming necessary. And necessity, once learned, rarely lets go. As usefulness settled into the body, it changed how time felt. Days grew longer, not because the sun stayed up, but because there was more to carry, more to remember, more to anticipate before anything went wrong. A girl learned to wake before she was called, not out of discipline, but because waiting for instruction wasted minutes, and minutes mattered. The world rewarded readiness with quiet approval. There was no ceremony to mark this readiness, no threshold to cross. Adults simply began to trust her with things that could not afford mistakes. A pot that could crack, a child that could wander, a task that could not be left half done. Trust arrived without celebration, and with it, weight. Education followed the same logic. Knowledge was passed hand to hand, eye to eye. You learned because someone showed you once, and then expected you to remember. Forgetting was corrected immediately. Repetition replaced explanation. The lesson was complete when the work was done properly and without supervision. Stories existed, but they were brief and practical. Warnings more than fantasies. Do this, not that. Remember where this belongs. Notice when this changes color, smell, texture. These were the details that mattered. Abstract thinking waited for quieter centuries. Because learning served survival, it moved quickly. There was no indulgence for lingering confusion. Clarity was kind. Efficiency was kindness too. A girl who learned fast reduced the burden on everyone else, including herself. And so attention sharpened early, not the wandering attention of curiosity, but the focused attention of responsibility, the kind that notices absence before presence, that senses imbalance before collapse. This attention stayed with women long after childhood had faded, shaping how they moved through the world. Play did not disappear entirely. It found places where it would not be seen as wasteful, in the brief space before sleep, in moments when hands were busy and minds could drift. Laughter slipped in quietly, like a visitor who knew when to leave. But play was never allowed to grow roots. It was a pause, not a place. This is why memory behaves strangely here. Childhood does not stand apart as a bright chapter. It dissolves into work so thoroughly that looking back feels like peering through water. Shapes are there, but edges are soft. Nothing insists on being remembered. Responsibility arrived before nostalgia had time to form. The body adapted first. Muscles strengthened. Movements became economical. Rest shortened without being named as loss. The mind followed, learning to accept fatigue as background rather than interruption. Tiredness became a condition, not a complaint. In the early medieval world, there was little patience for fragility once usefulness appeared. Fragility required accommodation. Usefulness earned tolerance. This was not unkindness. It was survival logic, repeated until it felt natural. Girls learned to take pride in competence, not loudly, quietly, in the satisfaction of being trusted, of being relied upon, of being necessary. Necessity replaced innocence without asking permission. Adults rarely reflected on this transition. Reflection would have raised questions with no practical answers. Instead, they treated the change as obvious, as something that happened because it had always happened. And so childhood ended not with sadness, but with momentum. By the time a girl might have wondered where her childhood went, there was no space left to search for it. The day had already claimed her attention. The work had already begun. This did not make life bleak. It made it steady, predictable, manageable, a life without sharp breaks or dramatic awakenings, a life where growth meant doing more of what needed doing, a little better each time. In this way, girlhood did not vanish. It was folded neatly into usefulness, pressed flat by repetition, and stored where it would not interfere with survival. And usefulness, once learned so early, stayed. And once usefulness settled in, it rarely loosened its grip. What changed most was not the work itself, but how it was expected. Tasks were no longer framed as help. They were assumed. A girl was no longer praised for remembering. Remembering became normal. Forgetting became noticeable. The world did not scold her loudly for mistakes, but it adjusted around her with a quiet disappointment that lingered longer than words. This is how responsibility matured. Not through punishment, but through awareness. A girl learned that her actions now had weight, that small errors could ripple outward, that attention was no longer optional. It was required, gently but firmly, every day. The early medieval world did not romanticize growth. There was no celebration of becoming older, no nostalgia for what had been left behind. Growth was simply an increase in expectation. More could be asked of you now, so more was. Adults did not say, "You are grown." They behaved as if it were already obvious. This lack of ceremony made the transition feel seamless. Childhood did not shatter. It thinned, it stretched, it dissolved slowly into habit. There was no moment to grieve it, even if grief had been possible. The pace of life did not slow to allow such reflection. Girls learned quickly that competence created belonging. The more capable they became, the more firmly they were woven into daily life. Involvement replaced protection. Being needed felt safer than being spared. There is a quiet logic to this that can sound cold when described aloud, but from within it felt ordinary. The world did not present alternatives, it presented needs, and meeting those needs created a sense of purpose that did not require explanation. Memory adjusted accordingly. Moments of childhood were not stored carefully. They were overwritten. Each day replaced the last with similar demands, leaving little contrast for memory to hold on to. Without contrast, recollection softened. The past became vague, not painful. This is why for many women childhood did not feel lost. It felt unfinished, as if it had simply blended into something else before it had time to stand alone. In later years, when women spoke of being young, they rarely described a separate time. They described smaller hands, lighter loads, fewer expectations. Not a different life, just a quieter version of the same one. The body remembered more clearly than the mind. Muscles carried traces of early labor. Movements retained efficiency learned too soon. Endurance became instinctive. Rest, when it came, felt earned rather than deserved. And so in the early medieval world, girlhood did not end with drama. It ended with usefulness, with the steady assumption that the body could now be relied upon, that attention would hold, that mistakes would be fewer. The world did not ask whether this was fair. Fairness was not part of the vocabulary. What mattered was that life continued without interruption. Girls became women not by crossing a threshold, but by being absorbed. Folded into the rhythm of survival so smoothly that the seam disappeared. They did not leave childhood behind. Childhood simply stopped being necessary. And in a world where necessity defined value, that was enough. Her world became smaller. Her responsibilities did not. As women grew older, the world did not open wider. It grew closer. Their lives unfolded mostly inside familiar spaces, rooms that did not change shape, courtyards that held the same shadows every afternoon, doorways worn smooth by repetition. These spaces were not prisons in the dramatic sense. They were simply where life happened. And because life happened there every day, they became dense with responsibility. A woman's world was small in distance but heavy in use. Each corner carried memory. Each surface had purpose. Nothing was decorative for long. Everything became involved in the work of living. Movement was limited, but presence was constant. A woman did not travel far, but she was everywhere within her domain. She moved between tasks the way water moves between vessels, without ceremony, without pause. One space did not belong to one duty. The same room held cooking, cleaning, teaching, resting, waiting. Tasks layered over each other until they became inseparable. This is how responsibility expanded without appearing to. In a confined world, efficiency mattered. Walking back and forth wasted energy. Forgetting wasted time, so women learned to hold many obligations at once. to remember while doing, to anticipate while finishing. Their attention split and multiplied, not because they enjoyed complexity, but because the structure demanded it. A woman's day did not have clear divisions. There was no beginning and end to work. Tasks blended into one another so thoroughly that rest itself became functional. Rest was not a break from labor, it was preparation for more of it. Space shaped this experience deeply. Living within narrow boundaries meant that every problem appeared close. There was no distance to soften difficulty. A crying child was always near. A pot left too long was always within smell. A mistake could not be ignored until later. It demanded immediate correction. And so women learned to stay alert without appearing tense, to maintain awareness without dramatizing it. This constant attentiveness became part of the body, as automatic as breathing. The outside world existed, of course. Men moved through it more freely. Markets, roads, gatherings, decisions made beyond walls. Women knew of these spaces, but they were not required to inhabit them regularly. Their labor was anchored elsewhere. This limitation was often described as natural. It was not questioned because questioning did not change geography. What mattered was not where women went, but what they kept functioning. And what they kept functioning expanded steadily. As a woman's physical world narrowed, her responsibilities stretched outward. She managed not only tasks, but people, not only supplies, but timing. She became the quiet organizer of life's details, the one who noticed when something was running low before it was gone, the one who adjusted plans without calling them plans. This expansion did not come with authority. It came with expectation. No one formally assigned these responsibilities. They accumulated. Each solved problem created trust. Each moment of competence added another unspoken duty. Soon, the absence of her attention would have been felt immediately. This is how responsibility grows. Not announced, not negotiated, simply assumed. A woman's life was measured not by where she went, but by what she completed. The end of a day was not marked by reflection, but by exhaustion. Satisfaction, when it appeared, came from having prevented disorder rather than having experienced something new. Experience, in the sense of novelty, was a luxury. What mattered was outcome. A successful day was one where nothing broke, where no one went hungry, where the rhythm held. This success did not feel triumphant. It felt quiet, almost invisible. Women learned to evaluate themselves by these standards. Not, what did I see today, but what did I manage to keep going? Not, where was I, but what did not fall apart because I was here? This inward measuring shaped identity slowly. A woman became what she maintained. Her sense of worth tied itself to completion, to reliability, to the absence of failure. There is a subtle humor in how thoroughly this logic worked. Women were entrusted with enormous complexity, yet denied formal acknowledgement of it. They ran systems without being called administrators. They solved problems without being called leaders. The world relied on their competence while pretending that competence required no recognition. Perhaps this is why ambition took such quiet forms. Women did not dream of expansion. They dreamed of smoother days, of fewer emergencies, of tasks that aligned neatly rather than colliding. Their hopes were practical, a little less strain, a little more predictability. These were not small desires in a world that rarely offered ease. The narrowness of physical space did not shrink women's awareness. If anything, it sharpened it. They noticed patterns others missed, changes in mood, shifts in routine, early signs of trouble. This awareness was born of proximity, of living so close to life's details that nothing remained abstract. But awareness did not lead to freedom. It led to responsibility. As years passed, the boundaries of a woman's world felt both familiar and complete. There was little expectation that it would widen. The outside world belonged to others. Her world belonged to function, and within that function, she became indispensable. This indispensability did not grant mobility. It anchored her more firmly in place. The more necessary she became, the harder it was to imagine her absence. Movement would have required replacement. Replacement was inconvenient. So the system preferred stability. Stability again came at the cost of expansion. By the middle of her life, a woman's world felt thoroughly known, not because it was simple, but because she had memorized it. Every demand, every corner, every rhythm. This familiarity brought a certain calm. There were fewer surprises, fewer unknowns. The price of that calm was repetition, and repetition shaped memory. Days blended together, events lost sharpness. Life became a long sequence of completed tasks rather than distinct experiences. Time passed, but it did not announce itself loudly. When women looked back, they did not recall adventures. They recalled periods of difficulty and periods of relative ease, times when things held together and times when they almost did not. Memory organized itself around effort rather than pleasure. This does not mean there was no joy. Joy existed, but it was quiet. It appeared in moments that did not interrupt work, in familiar faces, in small successes, in the rare luxury of a day without urgency. Joy fit where it could. So a woman's world grew smaller in space but larger in obligation. Her reach did not extend far geographically, but it extended deeply into the structure of daily life. She became the axis around which routine turned, not visible from a distance, but impossible to remove. And in this narrowing that widened responsibility, her life found its shape. And within that axis, life learned to rotate quietly. A woman rarely felt stationary, even when she barely moved. Her body remained within the same walls, the same thresholds, the same stretch of floor, worn smooth by years of passing. Yet her attention traveled constantly, from one task to the next, from one person's needs to another's, from what was happening now to what would need to be handled shortly after. Stillness, for her, was never empty. Each small space carried multiple timelines at once. What needed finishing, what needed starting, what needed watching so it would not turn into something worse. The room did not change, but its demands did, hour by hour. A woman learned to read those changes instinctively, the way one reads light shifting across a familiar wall. This was not chaos. It was orchestration. And because it was so close, so intimate, it required a kind of intelligence that rarely announces itself. Not the intelligence of planning large movements, but the intelligence of managing overlap, knowing which task could wait and which one could not, which problem would resolve itself, and which would quietly grow, if ignored. The narrowness of space intensified responsibility. There was no distance to escape to, no elsewhere where problems could be postponed. Everything happened here, now, under the same roof, in the same few rooms, so women learned to absorb pressure rather than deflect it. They became skilled at holding multiple concerns without letting any one of them dominate the room, at smoothing transitions, at keeping emotional weather from turning into storms. This labor was invisible because it left no trace once done properly. A day without conflict did not feel like an achievement. It felt like normal. And normal was hard won. The outside world, when it appeared at the edges of this small domain, arrived filtered. News came indirectly. Decisions made elsewhere arrived as conditions to adapt to, not arguments to join. A woman did not debate policy. She adjusted meals. She redistributed effort. She recalculated what could still be managed. In this way, large changes entered her life not as events, but as inconveniences, as shifts in routine, as added strain. The response was never dramatic. It was practical. This practicality shaped how women understood themselves. Identity was not built around exploration or expansion. It formed around reliability, around being the one who could be counted on when something quietly needed fixing. A woman knew her worth by how often she was interrupted and how seamlessly she handled those interruptions. Being needed constantly became proof of competence. Absence became the true marker of failure. There is a soft irony in how little room this left for selfhood as we imagine it today. But within this structure, women did not feel erased. They felt embedded, woven into the function of life so tightly that separating self from responsibility felt unnecessary, even unnatural. What mattered was not who she was alone, but who she was in relation to everything else that depended on her. Time reflected this logic. Hours were not counted for themselves. They were counted by what had been accomplished within them. A day passed successfully if its demands had been met. Whether it had been pleasant was secondary. Pleasure was allowed, but only if it did not interfere. This did not produce bitterness. It produced realism, a grounded understanding of limits. Women learned where effort made a difference and where it did not. They conserved themselves accordingly. By doing so, they kept the system stable. And stability once again was valued more than movement. As years accumulated, the small world did not feel confining. It felt known, intimately known, predictable in its unpredictability. The patterns repeated often enough to become familiar, but never so perfectly that vigilance could be abandoned. This familiarity brought a kind of quiet authority. A woman who knew the space knew how life worked within it. Others deferred to that knowledge without naming it. Decisions happened around her, through her, sometimes because of her, but rarely in her name. Her influence moved sideways rather than upward. And so, the world of women remained physically narrow, but structurally wide. It reached into every corner of daily life, touching everything that needed to continue without drawing attention to itself. A woman did not travel far, but nothing functioned far from her. Her world may have been small in distance, but it was large in consequence. And in that space, familiar, enclosed, endlessly active, her life unfolded, measured not by what she experienced, but by what she sustained, quietly, consistently, without pause. This narrowing of space stopped feeling like a loss. It felt like familiarity. A woman knew every sound inside her world. She could tell which step belonged to which person, which silence meant rest, and which meant trouble. She knew the exact moment when something was about to go wrong, not because she was anxious, but because she had learned the rhythm too well. Life spoke softly here, and she had trained herself to listen. The weight of responsibility did not arrive all at once. It accumulated gently, the way dust does. One task added to another. One expectation settled beside the last. None of them announced themselves as burdens. They simply stayed. This is how responsibility becomes invisible. A woman rarely described her life as busy. Busy implies temporary. Her life was full in a more permanent way. Full of things that could not be postponed, full of tasks that belonged to no one else once they had quietly become hers. Because movement was limited, completion became the measure of worth. Not discovery, not novelty, completion. A finished task, a resolved problem, a day that ended without damage. These were achievements that did not require witnesses. And so, life became a long chain of completions. Some small, some heavy, all necessary. There was little sense of accumulation in the modern meaning of the word. Nothing was collected for personal satisfaction. Everything was done to keep the present stable. The future was approached cautiously, as something that would arrive regardless of preparation. Women learned to live almost entirely in this careful present. When people spoke of them, they did not describe adventures or journeys. They spoke of reliability, of steadiness, of how things ran smoothly when she was there. Praise, when it appeared, was indirect, often framed as absence. Nothing went wrong today. This was considered success. It is easy from a distance to see only restriction here, to see walls and repetition and conclude confinement. But within this world, women did not experience themselves as static. They experienced themselves as central, as the point around which motion happened. Others came and went. Tasks changed hands. Conditions shifted. But the structure held because someone remained attentive within it. That someone was usually a woman. As years passed, the boundaries of her world became almost comforting. They reduced uncertainty. They narrowed risk. She knew what could be handled and what could not. She knew where effort mattered and where it would be wasted. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was lived. And because it was lived daily, it felt real. In a way, abstract freedom did not. Freedom, after all, is most useful when there is space to use it. In a world balanced carefully on survival, space was scarce. What existed instead was responsibility, and women learned how to inhabit it with quiet skill. The world outside continued. Markets shifted. Power changed hands. Decisions were made beyond her reach. But inside her small, familiar space, life continued because she managed it. This did not make her visible. It made her indispensable. And so, as the physical world of women narrowed, their significance expanded in directions that history rarely measures, not outward but inward, into routine, into continuity, into the invisible systems that keep life from unraveling. A woman's world was small. Her responsibility was not. And in that imbalance, her life found its steady, enduring shape. Women did the work that was never allowed to stop. Some kinds of work are only noticed when they disappear. The labor women performed in the early medieval world did not arrive in moments. It did not announce itself. It did not create scenes that could be pointed to later and remembered. It existed instead as continuation, as the quiet assurance that things were still in place, still functioning, still moving in the correct order. This kind of work was not designed to finish. It was designed to repeat. A woman's labor did not aim toward a climax. There was no final result to admire. Cooking did not end hunger forever. Cleaning did not make a space permanently clean. Care did not eliminate the need for care tomorrow. Each task dissolved into the next, forming a loop rather than a line. Because nothing ended, nothing stood out. History prefers beginnings and endings, declarations, disruptions, events that can be named and dated. The work women did resisted this structure completely. It did not begin dramatically, and it never truly finished. It simply continued day after day without asking to be noticed, and so it was rarely recorded. The absence of recognition was not an oversight. It was a consequence of function. Work that prevents collapse leaves little evidence behind. When it succeeds, nothing happens. And nothing happening from a historical perspective is remarkably difficult to describe. Women kept water available. They kept food edible. They kept bodies clothed. Rested just enough, watched closely enough. These actions did not change the course of history, but they allowed history to have a course at all. If this labor paused even briefly, the effects would be immediate. Meals would not appear. Children would wander. Small problems would grow loud. Disorder would enter quickly, not as drama, but as inconvenience. The system relied on women's constancy precisely because it could not tolerate gaps. This is why their work was never allowed to stop. There were no official shifts, no clear divisions between effort and rest. Rest was taken only when interruption would cause more harm than fatigue. Even then, rest remained alert, half listening, half prepared to move again. Women learned to live inside this continuous demand without naming it as such. Naming it would have required distance, and distance was rarely available. Instead, endurance became normal. Effort settled into the background of the body. This normalization had consequences. When something functioned smoothly, it was assumed to be natural. When women kept things running, the world attributed success to order rather than to labor. Order appeared self-sustaining, as if it required no maintenance at all. Maintenance, by its nature, hides itself. This is where a quiet irony emerges. The more consistently women worked, the less visible their work became. Reliability erased evidence, repetition dissolved memory. Over time, the system forgot that effort was required in the first place. History inherited this forgetting. Later accounts would speak of stable households, functioning communities, orderly rhythms of life. They would rarely ask who maintained those rhythms or how much attention that maintenance required. Stability would be treated as a given, not an achievement. Women lived inside this assumption. They learned that their value lay not in producing moments, but in preventing moments from happening. Not in creating stories, but in making sure there were no stories worth telling. No crises, no interruptions, no failures, large enough to demand explanation. A good day was one that passed quietly. This did not mean women lacked awareness of their own effort. They felt it in their bodies, in the steady accumulation of fatigue, in the careful pacing required to last. But because their labor produced no visible endpoint, it rarely invited reflection. You cannot stand back and admire a task that must be repeated tomorrow. And so women learn to measure success differently, not by completion, but by continuity. If things held together, the work had been done well enough. No praise was necessary. Praise, again, would have implied exception, and exception would have disrupted the rhythm. There is a gentle, almost dry humor in this arrangement. The work most essential to daily life was the least likely to be celebrated. The tasks without which nothing functioned were treated as if they required no effort at all. The system depended on women not stopping, and then behaved as if their not stopping were simply the natural state of the world. This expectation did not come with gratitude. Gratitude implies awareness. Awareness might invite reconsideration. So instead, regularity was assumed, and assumption replaced acknowledgement. Women adapted to this quietly. They did not expect applause. They did not wait for recognition. They learned that the reward for their labor was continuity itself. Another day that worked, another night that arrived without damage. In a fragile world, that reward mattered. And so women did the work that was never allowed to stop, not because it was noble, not because it was chosen, but because stopping would have unraveled everything that depended on it. History, looking back, sees only the calm surface, the absence of disruption, the sense that life simply went on. It rarely sees the hands that kept it that way, but those hands were always there. Work was no longer something you began or finished. It was something you stayed inside, like weather, like heat, something that surrounded you and adjusted your movements without asking permission. You did not plan to work. You planned around the fact that work would always be there. This changed the way women related to rest. Rest was not a reward. It was a calculation. A short pause taken only when the cost of continuing was greater than the cost of stopping briefly. Even then, stopping never meant disengaging. The body might sit, but the attention remained upright, listening for signs that something required intervention. In this world, interruption was not dramatic. It was constant. A woman learned to resume tasks without resentment, because resentment required time to grow. There was rarely time. One thing pulled her away, then another still. The work did not apologize for interrupting itself. It assumed priority. This assumption became internal. Women stopped expecting clear boundaries between effort and relief. They learned to move fluidly between states, carrying unfinished things with them, returning to them later without frustration. This flexibility was not celebrated. It was relied upon. And because it was relied upon, it became invisible. The repetition of women's labor created an illusion of permanence. Houses appeared to maintain themselves. Meals appeared when expected. Order seemed to persist without assistance. The system mistook consistency for inevitability. This is how the work disappeared from view. When something went wrong, attention flared briefly. A shortage, a mess, a disruption. But once corrected, the correction vanished from memory. What remained was the restored calm, not the effort that produced it. Women learned that their labor would be noticed only in its absence. This awareness did not lead to protest. Protest would have required stopping, and stopping was not an option. Instead, women refined their endurance. They learned to distribute effort across the day, to pace themselves so that the work could continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Endurance became an art. It was expressed not in dramatic gestures, but in restraint, in knowing when not to hurry, in understanding which tasks could be left imperfect without consequence, in conserving energy without appearing to slow down. This restraint gave women a quiet authority. They understood the limits of the system better than anyone else because they felt those limits directly. They knew how much could be asked before something gave way. They adjusted expectations accordingly, often without needing to say anything aloud. Others rarely noticed this adjustment. They simply experienced the result, a world that kept working. There is a particular irony here that history tends to overlook. The labor that sustains continuity is often interpreted as absence of labor. Smoothness is mistaken for ease. Regularity is mistaken for natural order. Women lived inside that misunderstanding. They carried the knowledge that if they stopped, even briefly, things would unravel, not catastrophically at first, quietly, subtly, enough to create discomfort, enough to demand attention, enough to disrupt the rhythm that everyone depended on. And because disruption was undesirable, prevention became their task. Prevention, however, leaves no monument. No record marks the day when nothing went wrong because a woman noticed something early. No chronicle celebrates the crisis that never happened. These moments dissolve into normality as soon as they occur. This is why women's labor remains difficult to trace. It resists narration. It produces no climax, no resolution, no aftermath. It simply continues. Even women themselves did not always articulate what they were doing. Naming it would have required stepping back, and stepping back would have created distance. Distance was unsafe. Attention belonged close to the task. So labor remained unnamed, unexamined, and essential. As years passed, this continuous effort shaped women's sense of time. Days were not distinguished by events, but by intensity. A hard day, a manageable day, a day where something almost went wrong. Memory organized itself around strain rather than story. And yet, within this repetition, women found a certain quiet competence. A confidence born not of recognition, but of familiarity. They knew what needed doing. They knew how to do it. They trusted themselves, even if the system did not openly acknowledge that trust. This self-trust mattered. It allowed women to continue performing work that was never allowed to stop without breaking under the weight of it. It gave them a narrow, private sense of agency within a structure that depended on their constancy. And so the work went on, not loudly, not proudly, but steadily. Always steadily. And slowly, this endless work reshaped how women understood the idea of importance itself. Importance was no longer attached to visibility or outcome. It attached itself to continuity, to the simple fact that things did not fall apart, that the day reached its end without damage. That night arrived quietly, as expected, without leaving anything unresolved enough to wake people later. Women learned that their labor mattered most when it left no trace. The better they did it, the less anyone noticed. A meal that appeared on time did not feel like an achievement. A clean space did not feel earned. A child who slept peacefully did not signal effort. These things felt natural, as if they had happened on their own, and that illusion of effortlessness became the measure of success. This is why women's work was never allowed to stop. Stopping would have broken the illusion. It would have exposed the fragile scaffolding beneath daily life. Even a short pause could turn order into inconvenience, and inconvenience into irritation. The system depended on women continuing precisely so that it would never have to acknowledge how dependent it was. History inherited this assumption. When later observers looked back, they saw stability and routine. They saw households functioning, communities enduring, rhythms repeating. They did not see the attention required to keep those rhythms intact. They did not see the constant adjustments, the quiet calculations, the restraint practiced hour after hour. Regularity appeared self-sustaining, and so it was treated as unremarkable. Women lived inside that unremarkable space. Their labor did not accumulate into moments that could be celebrated or recorded. It dissolved into the background of life, becoming indistinguishable from order itself. When things worked, no one asked why. When things failed, the question was how quickly they could be restored, not who had been preventing failure all along. Over time, women internalized this logic. They did not expect acknowledgement because acknowledgement would have disrupted the rhythm they worked so hard to preserve. They learned to take satisfaction from continuity rather than praise, from smoothness rather than recognition. Their reward was a world that kept moving forward without interruption. There is a quiet, almost ironic calm in this arrangement. The work most essential to survival was the least visible. The people who carried it were expected to do so indefinitely, without pause, without comment, without history taking notice. And because the work succeeded so consistently, history concluded that it required no explanation. Women did the work that was never allowed to stop, and in doing so, they allowed everything else to appear stable, ordinary, and inevitable. The days passed, the nights arrived, life continued, quietly convinced that this continuation required no special effort at all. Marriage was a transfer of duty, and the female body was something to be maintained. Marriage did not arrive as a choice, it arrived as a rearrangement. For women in the early medieval world, marriage was not imagined as a personal turning point filled with emotion or anticipation. It functioned more like a quiet handover, a practical shift in responsibility from one household to another. One set of expectations loosened, another tightened, and life continued without needing to pause for reflection. Nothing about this transition asked how a woman felt. What mattered was that the structure remained intact. A woman did not move into marriage carrying her own future. Her future had already been packaged. Marriage simply redirected it. Authority over her life passed from her family to another, not dramatically, but administratively. The tasks changed location. The obligations adjusted shape. The logic stayed the same. Stability mattered more than happiness because happiness was unpredictable. It fluctuated. It required attention. Stability, on the other hand, could be planned for. It could be maintained. And in a world where disruption was costly, maintenance was the highest priority. This is why women learned to adapt faster then their emotions could follow. Feeling took time. Adaptation did not. The body learned new routines before the mind could fully register the loss of old ones. New rhythms replaced familiar ones quickly, leaving little space to dwell on what had changed. Dwelling, after all, did not keep things running. Marriage asked a woman to fit again, to recalibrate herself to a new household, new expectations, new patterns of labor. The skills she had already learned made this possible. She knew how to observe, how to adjust, how to absorb responsibility quietly. These skills mattered far more than affection. The female body sat at the center of this arrangement. It was not understood as personal property. It belonged to the structure that depended on it. It was monitored, protected, and controlled, not out of tenderness, but out of necessity. The body needed to last. It needed to function. It needed to continue. Desire was not irrelevant, but it was not decisive. Personal inclination carried little weight next to social need. What mattered was capacity, health, endurance. The ability to perform required functions without interruption. A body that could do this was valuable. A body that could not was a problem to be managed. In this sense, care was practical rather than compassionate. The body was maintained the way tools were maintained, not because they were loved, but because they were essential. Attention was given where it preserved usefulness, withdrawn where it did not. Women learned to experience their bodies through this lens, not as expressions of self, but as instruments of continuity. Fatigue was acknowledged only when it threatened function. Pain was endured unless it interfered with duty. Rest was taken strategically, not indulgently. This arrangement did not erase feeling. It subordinated it. Emotion existed, but it did not direct decisions. Decisions followed stability. Stability followed repetition. Repetition followed expectation. Marriage reinforced this hierarchy. It confirmed that a woman's value lay not in her inner life, but in her ability to maintain order across time. Her worth was measured by smoothness, by how little disruption followed her presence, by how seamlessly she absorbed the demands placed upon her. And because this absorption worked so well, it appeared natural. The system mistook adaptation for consent, endurance for satisfaction, silence for agreement. Women rarely corrected this misunderstanding. Correction required leverage, and leverage was scarce. Instead, they refined their ability to live inside it, to find moments of calm where possible, to adjust expectations so that disappointment did not grow too heavy. Marriage, then, did not redefine a woman. It confirmed her role. It formalized what had already been true, that her life would be shaped by obligation rather than choice, by continuation rather than fulfillment. The body remained central to this truth, watched carefully, preserved carefully, used carefully, not for pleasure, not for expression, but for function, for the ongoing work of keeping the world from unraveling. And so marriage did not ask whether a woman was happy. It asked whether life would remain stable. Once this transfer was complete, it rarely needed to be discussed again. Marriage did not invite revisiting. It established a new normal and expected everyone to adapt quietly. For women, this adaptation happened quickly, not because they felt ready, but because readiness was not required. The rhythm of daily life resumed almost immediately, leaving little space for the emotions to catch up. Feelings, when they surfaced, learned to move alongside duty rather than in front of it. A woman's sense of self adjusted accordingly. What she had been before marriage did not disappear, but it folded inward, becoming less relevant to the work ahead. The household did not need her history. It needed her presence, her attention, her capacity to keep things steady. And so identity reorganized itself around function the way it always had. The body, meanwhile, became the quiet center of this expectation. It was watched carefully, not out of intimacy, but out of concern for continuity. Health was valued because illness interrupted routine. Strength was encouraged because weakness slowed work. Even protection followed this logic. The body mattered because it needed to last, not because it belonged to the woman herself. In this system, care did not mean freedom. It meant preservation. A body was maintained so it could continue to perform, to adapt, to endure. Desire did not disappear, but it learned not to lead. Personal wishes were acknowledged only when they aligned with stability. When they did not, they softened, adjusted, or waited indefinitely. Women learned to read these limits early. They understood which pains could be spoken and which should be carried quietly, which discomforts were tolerable and which required intervention. This knowledge did not come from theory. It came from living inside a structure that rewarded silence more consistently than expression. Marriage reinforced this lesson. It taught women that belonging was conditional on reliability, that care was offered as long as function was preserved, that stability outweighed satisfaction because satisfaction could not be guaranteed, but stability could be managed. There is a subtle, almost dry irony here. Women were expected to adapt endlessly, yet the system relied on that adaptation so completely that it never questioned it. Flexibility was assumed, endurance was expected. And because women delivered both so consistently, the arrangement appeared balanced. Balanced, but not equal. Still, within this structure, women developed their own quiet expertise. They learned how to pace themselves, how to protect their bodies just enough to keep going, how to create small pockets of calm without disrupting expectation. These strategies were not rebellions. They were survival techniques refined over time. Marriage did not give women ownership over their bodies or their futures. It confirmed that both would remain tied to the needs of others. But within that constraint, women learned to inhabit their roles with skill, restraint, and a measured kind of calm. The system did not ask whether this was fair. It asked whether it worked. And because it did, it continued. Stability held. Life moved on. This arrangement settled so deeply that it no longer felt imposed. It felt normal. Marriage did not appear as a rupture in a woman's life, but as a continuation under new management. The work remained familiar. The expectation shifted slightly in shape, but not in weight. What changed was not what was required of her, but who now relied on her constancy. The body remained central to this quiet exchange. It was no longer seen as something belonging to the woman herself, but as something that needed to be preserved for the sake of continuity. Health became a shared concern. Strength became an asset. Endurance became a quiet expectation. The body was watched, adjusted, rested when necessary, pushed when possible. Not because it was cherished, but because it was needed to last. In this system, care and control were closely intertwined. Protection did not mean autonomy. It meant supervision. Attention did not mean listening. It meant monitoring. A woman learned to understand her body less as a source of personal experience and more as a resource that had to remain functional over time. Discomfort was tolerated as long as it did not interrupt the rhythm of life. Pain became significant only when it threatened continuity. Personal desire, when it surfaced, learned to speak softly. It was not erased, but it was rarely allowed to influence outcomes. Wanting something different did not alter the structure. So wanting adjusted itself instead. It learned to accept delay, to become smaller, to exist without expectation of fulfillment. This was not resignation so much as adaptation, practiced until it felt instinctive. Marriage confirmed what had already been true, that stability mattered more than happiness because happiness could not be organized, but stability could. A stable household could be maintained. A stable routine could be repeated. Happiness, on the other hand, came and went without warning. The system preferred what could be managed, and so women learned to measure their lives accordingly, not by how they felt, but by how well things held together around them. A successful marriage was one without disruption. A successful body was one that continued to function. A successful woman was one whose presence did not create friction. There is a quiet, almost unspoken irony here. Women were expected to adapt endlessly, yet the system depended so completely on that adaptation that it never considered alternatives. Flexibility was assumed, not requested. Endurance was taken for granted. And because women provided both so consistently, the arrangement appeared balanced, even gentle. Within these limits, women developed a careful relationship with their own bodies. They learned how much they could give without breaking, how to pace effort, how to protect themselves quietly while appearing endlessly available. These small strategies did not challenge the structure, but they made life inside it bearable. Marriage, then, did not transform a woman's fate. It clarified it. It reaffirmed that her body and her labor belonged not to her alone, but to the ongoing order that relied on them. Her value lay not in what she felt, but in what continued, because she endured. The world did not ask whether she was content. It asked whether things remained stable. Silence was a survival skill. Silence in this world was not emptiness. It was work done inward. Women learned early that speaking less often meant being interrupted less often. Words invited response, and response could become conflict. Conflict required energy, explanation, and time, all of which were better conserved. Silence, by contrast, passed unnoticed. It allowed a day to move forward without friction, which in a fragile system counted as success. This silence did not mean women lacked thoughts. It meant their thoughts had limited destinations. There were few spaces where reflection could be placed safely without consequences. To speak was to expose an idea to judgment, resistance, or dismissal. To remain quiet was to keep options open, even if those options remained internal. Women became careful observers. They learned to read faces, tones, pauses. They noticed shifts before they were announced. This attentiveness was not curiosity for its own sake. It was defensive. Knowing when something was about to turn unpleasant allowed them to adjust before the moment hardened. A small silence at the right time could prevent a much louder outcome later. Waiting became another form of action. Not passive waiting, but strategic delay. Women learned that not every response needed to be immediate. Time could soften demands. Circumstances could change. What felt urgent now might dissolve quietly if left alone. Silence created space for that dissolution. This skill was practiced daily. A woman adjusted her words to the room she was in, the people present, the mood passing through. She learned which questions were welcome and which would be ignored, which concerns could be raised indirectly and which should remain unspoken. This was not self-erasure. It was calibration. Silence also protected effort. Speaking required justification. Justification invited scrutiny. Scrutiny often led to additional expectations rather than relief. By saying less, women preserved a narrow margin of control over their own energy. They could continue doing what needed to be done without having to explain why it was necessary in the first place. From the outside, this restraint was sometimes mistaken for obedience or gentleness. But restraint is not the same as submission. It is a choice made under constraint, a strategy refined through repetition. Women did not remain silent because they believed silence was virtuous. They remained silent because it reduced risk. In a world where speaking rarely changed outcomes, silence became efficient. This efficiency shaped how women related to themselves. Thoughts were organized internally. Decisions were rehearsed quietly. Adjustments were made without announcement. A woman learned to move within situations rather than against them, conserving strength for moments when action mattered more than expression. There is a quiet irony here. Silence made women appear simple, while their inner calculations grew increasingly complex. They tracked multiple possibilities at once, weighing consequences, choosing the least costly path. This mental labor left no visible trace, and so it was rarely acknowledged. Over time, silence became fluent. Not awkward, not forced, comfortable. A woman knew when to let words pass without catching them. She knew when a nod would carry more meaning than a sentence. This fluency allowed her to navigate tension without escalating it. Silence also created distance, not physical distance, but emotional safety. By revealing little, women protected themselves from becoming targets of blame or expectation. What was not spoken could not be challenged directly. What remained unsaid retained a measure of control. This did not make silence easy. It made it useful. Women did not idealize it. They relied on it. Like any tool, it was shaped by necessity. Used carefully, stored close at hand, taken out whenever conditions became unstable. And so silence was not a virtue cultivated for moral reasons. It was a technique learned through experience, a way of surviving within structures that offered few rewards for speaking openly and many penalties for speaking at the wrong moment. In this quiet practice, women preserved their balance. They watched, they waited, they adjusted. And in doing so, they kept themselves and the fragile order around them intact. Silence was not absence, it was strategy. With time, silence became more than avoidance. It became a way of thinking. Women learned to arrange their thoughts internally, the way others arranged their belongings in rooms they were free to enter. Ideas were tested quietly before ever being exposed. Emotions were examined in private, weighed for usefulness, and often set aside if they offered no advantage. This was not suppression. It was sorting, a practical form of order applied to the inner world. Silence allowed women to listen more than they spoke, and listening in this world was power of a very specific kind. Not the power to command, but the power to anticipate, to sense when a situation was about to change direction, to notice when tension was building and when it was dissolving on its own. This sensitivity did not come from intuition alone. It came from long practice in environments where speaking carried consequences. A woman learned when to pause a conversation by saying nothing at all, when to let another voice tire itself out, when agreement could be implied without being stated. These small decisions shaped outcomes quietly, often without anyone noticing that they had been shaped. Silence also protected women from being fixed in place. Words can be repeated, quoted, used later. Silence leaves fewer traces. By saying less, women kept themselves flexible. They could adapt their position without contradicting themselves. They could adjust without explanation. In a world that valued consistency, this flexibility mattered. There is a subtle irony here. Women were often described as simple, even empty, because they did not speak at length. Yet the silence they practiced required constant calculation. It demanded awareness of hierarchy, mood, timing, and consequence. Few people were working harder internally than those who appeared most quiet. This internal labor went unseen, much like their physical labor. And like that labor, it was essential to keeping daily life smooth. A careless word could undo hours of careful effort. Silence, when used well, prevented that undoing. Over time, women stopped experiencing silence as restraint. It became a familiar space, a place where thoughts could settle without pressure, where emotions could soften before being acted upon, if they were acted upon at all. Silence offered a narrow refuge in a world that demanded constant adjustment. This refuge was not freedom, but it was shelter. Women did not expect silence to change their circumstances. They expected it to help them endure them. And endurance, again, was the goal that mattered most. So silence was practiced daily, in conversations, in negotiations, in moments of disagreement that never fully formed. It became part of how women moved through the world, as natural as the way they carried weight or paced their effort. They did not remain silent because they believed silence was good. They remained silent because it worked. And in a system that rewarded what worked, silence became one of the most reliable skills a woman could possess. This practiced silence reshaped how women understood themselves. They did not think of silence as absence, but as presence held inward, a way of staying intact. In situations where speaking could provoke resistance or demand justification, silence allowed women to remain uncommitted, unpinned, and quietly adaptable. It was not hesitation. It was control exercised invisibly. Silence also softened the edges of fatigue. When effort filled every day, words felt expensive. Explaining oneself required energy that could not always be spared. By saying less, women conserved strength. They let actions speak, not because actions were more expressive, but because they were unavoidable. What needed to be done would be done whether it was discussed or not. In this way, silence became efficient. It reduced friction. It lowered exposure. It allowed women to move through tense moments without becoming their focus. While others spoke and argued, women adjusted. While decisions were debated elsewhere, women prepared for their consequences. Silence kept them one step ahead, not in authority, but in readiness. This readiness carried its own quiet confidence. Women learned that not every thought needed an audience, not every feeling needed validation. Some things could remain internal and still be real. This internal space became a kind of shelter, a place where judgment did not immediately reach. From the outside, this could be misread as submission, but submission gives up agency. Silence preserved it. By withholding words, women retained the ability to respond later, differently, or not at all. In a world where speaking rarely shifted outcomes, restraint proved more flexible than confrontation. Silence also allowed time to work. Many tensions dissolved without intervention. Many demands softened if left unanswered. Women learned to trust this slow resolution. Waiting was not inaction. It was a deliberate pause that let circumstances reveal their true weight. Over years of practice, silence became fluent. It no longer felt heavy or forced. It moved naturally with women as they navigated households, relationships, and expectations. It became part of their posture, their timing, their sense of when to engage and when to step back. This fluency did not erase thought. It refined it. Women thought carefully, selectively, knowing that not every idea benefited from being spoken aloud. Thought became precise. Speech became optional. And so silence remained, not as virtue, not as obedience, but as a skill shaped by necessity, a method of survival in structures that offered little reward for openness and many risks for miscalculation. Women did not glorify silence. They relied on it. They watched. They waited. They adjusted. And within that quiet practice, they preserved themselves and the fragile balance around them, one unspoken moment at a time. History overlooked women because they were too necessary. History has a preference. It leans toward disruption. It remembers what breaks the rhythm of life, wars, declarations, collapses loud enough to require explanation. History likes moments when order fails, because failure leaves a mark that can be named and dated. What holds steady, by contrast, rarely asks to be written down. Stability does not announce itself, it simply continues. Women existed on the side of continuation. Their lives were arranged not to interrupt the flow of daily life, but to keep it intact. While history searched for moments of change, women worked to prevent change from becoming dangerous. They did not produce turning points, they absorbed strain, they softened impact, they repaired quietly before damage became visible. This is why history passes over them so easily, not because they were absent, but because they were constant. What happened each day was not remarkable enough to be recorded. Meals prepared, children guided, spaces maintained. Problems reduced before they demanded attention. These actions did not qualify as events. They repeated too often. They succeeded too quietly. And repetition to history looks like nothing at all. Yet repetition is precisely what kept societies alive. Without the steady return of daily labor, nothing dramatic could have lasted long enough to matter. No victory survives without maintenance. No structure stands without care. The work women performed did not interrupt history, but it made history possible by preventing collapse between its louder moments. Women did not live for rupture. They lived for endurance. Resistance, when considered, was rarely rewarded. It invited attention, and attention often came with consequences that made life harder rather than better. Speaking too loudly, pushing too openly, risked drawing pressure onto already fragile lives. In a world balanced carefully on limited resources, disruption was expensive. So, women learned that persistence carried less risk than protest. This persistence was not romantic. It was practical. It did not imagine itself as noble suffering or silent heroism. It functioned as calculation. Endure today so tomorrow can still happen. Choose the path that costs the least energy. Avoid moves that might demand explanation or defense. Endurance did not mean passivity. It meant choosing battles carefully and often choosing not to fight at all. It meant adjusting expectations instead of confronting structures unlikely to change. Women learned to survive within limits rather than attempt to escape them. History later would mistake this choice for acceptance. But acceptance implies approval. What women practiced was closer to assessment. They understood the conditions they lived under and responded in ways that maximized survival. In this context, resistance was not a moral failure. It was a strategic decision weighed against consequence. The quieter path was often the safer one. This is why women's lives leave such faint traces in the record. They did not seek to be remembered. Memory requires exposure, and exposure carried risk. Being named meant being seen. Being seen invited judgment, control, or punishment. Remaining unnamed allowed life to continue with fewer interruptions. Women chose survival over recognition. They did not build monuments, they maintained foundations. They did not announce change. They prevented deterioration. Their labor kept societies functioning long enough for history to notice something else worth writing about. And so history moved past them, not because they were insignificant, but because they were indispensable in ways that resisted narration. What they did could not be summarized as an event. It unfolded as routine, as repetition, as days that looked like other days, and therefore disappeared into each other. This disappearance was not accidental. It was structural. Women existed to keep order from breaking, and history existed to record when order did break. Between these two impulses, women were always going to remain difficult to see. Yet without their endurance, there would have been far less history to record at all. They lived not to be remembered, but to remain alive. And in choosing survival over names, they ensured that the world itself continued quietly, one repeated day at a time. This preference for endurance shaped how women understood time itself. History measured time in moments that stood apart. Women measured it in stretches that held together. A year was not remembered for what happened once, but for what did not collapse across its length. Survival did not require drama. It required consistency. Women learned early that disruption attracted attention, and attention rarely brought relief. When something broke loudly enough to be noticed, it often brought new rules, new pressures, and new forms of control. Quiet persistence, by contrast, allowed a certain freedom of movement inside narrow limits. You could adjust without being corrected. You could endure without being examined. This is why resistance remained rare and carefully calculated, not because women lacked awareness, but because awareness included consequence. Resistance required energy, allies, and a tolerance for instability. Few women could afford all three at once. Endurance, while exhausting, was predictable. It allowed life to be planned, if only a little. The world did not reward suffering with meaning. It rewarded functionality. So suffering was managed rather than displayed. Pain was carried privately. Frustration was folded inward, not out of virtue, but out of efficiency. Displaying distress did not reduce it. Continuing often did. There is a quiet practicality in this choice that can sound cold when described from a distance, but from within it felt sensible. Women chose the option that preserved the most future. Not the most dignity, not the most recognition, but the most continuity. In fragile conditions, continuity mattered more than memory. History later interpreted this endurance as silence, as absence, as lack of action. But endurance is not inaction. It is action repeated without applause. It is the daily decision to keep going, even when stopping would be understandable. Women endured not because they believed endurance was noble, but because it worked. They learned how to bend without breaking, how to absorb pressure without shattering, how to accept limits without surrendering entirely. These skills did not produce legends. They produced lives that lasted. And lasting, in many ways, was the most radical outcome available. The record of the past rarely captures this. It prefers the exceptional over the constant. It names the moment something changed, not the years when nothing was allowed to fall apart. Women lived in those years. They made them possible. So when history looks empty here, it is not because nothing was happening. It is because too much was happening, too steadily, too predictably, to stand out. The machinery of daily life was running smoothly, and smooth machinery attracts little attention. Women did not resist loudly. They resisted collapse. They did not fight to be remembered. They fought quietly to remain. And by choosing survival over recognition, they ensured that the world could continue long enough for history to keep writing about something else. This quiet choice shaped what survival looked like. Survival did not appear as victory, it appeared as continuation, as another morning that arrived without disaster, another evening where nothing had gone wrong enough to require explanation. Women learned to value these unremarkable successes because unremarkable meant safe. The world rarely offered rewards for endurance, but it punished disruption quickly. Women noticed this pattern early. Those who pushed too hard, spoke too openly, or demanded change too visibly often found their lives becoming more difficult, not more just. Attention brought scrutiny. Scrutiny brought control. Control reduced room to maneuver. So endurance became not only the safer option, but the more flexible one. This endurance was not passive waiting, it was active maintenance. Women adjusted themselves to shifting conditions, recalculated effort, redistributed energy. They responded to pressure by absorbing it rather than deflecting it outward. This absorption kept daily life stable even when the larger world changed around them. History, watching from a distance, mistook this stability for emptiness. It saw no uprisings, no declarations, no moments worth naming. What it failed to see was the cost of keeping things from breaking. The labor of endurance leaves no scars on the surface. Its evidence disappears the moment it succeeds. Women lived with this disappearance. They understood that being remembered required standing apart, and standing apart required risk. Risk threatened survival, so they chose survival instead. Memory in this context was not a gift. It was a liability. Being named meant being fixed in place, turned into an example, subjected to judgment long after the moment had passed. Remaining unnamed allowed women to keep moving quietly within their lives. adapting without leaving traces. This is why women rarely appear as individuals in historical accounts. Their lives were not organized around singular moments. They were organized around persistence, and persistence does not compress easily into stories. Women did not seek to interrupt history. They worked to ensure that history could continue at all. They held the fabric of daily life together while larger forces pulled at its edges. They filled the long spaces between events, the spaces where societies either endure or quietly unravel. Their endurance was not heroic. It was practical, not idealized, not celebrated, simply repeated, day after day, because repetition cost less than resistance. And so history passed over them not because they were marginal, but because they were central in a way history does not know how to honor. Their lives did not point toward change. They pointed toward continuation. Women chose to remain. They chose to last. And in choosing survival over remembrance, they became the reason the world itself did not disappear. A woman's life ended and order continued. A woman's life did not conclude with an interruption. It faded the way a sound fades when no one is listening for it anymore. When a woman disappeared from the rhythm of daily life, the work did not pause to acknowledge her absence. Meals were still prepared. Spaces were still kept in order. Children were still guided from one hour to the next. Another pair of hands, often trained quietly long before, stepped forward, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. The system did not mourn gaps. It absorbed them. There was no empty space left behind that history could notice. This was not cruelty. It was design. The work women did had been structured so completely around repetition that no single person was meant to be irreplaceable. Tasks were learned early, passed down without ceremony, embedded so deeply into routine that they seemed to belong to the day itself rather than to any individual. When one woman was gone, the pattern remained intact, and so her absence produced no visible rupture. From the outside, it appeared as if nothing had changed. The household still functioned. The rhythm still held. The day still reached its end. If grief existed, it lived quietly alongside necessity. There was little space for pause. The world did not wait long enough for loss to reshape it. History later found nothing to record. There were no titles to inherit, no public acts to commemorate, no decisive moments that could be dated. A woman's life did not conclude with a final gesture. It concluded with the same steadiness with which it had been lived. Quietly, without announcement, without leaving a mark large enough to interrupt the record. This absence of trace reveals something important. Women had not simply participated in order, they had dissolved into it. Their labor had become indistinguishable from structure itself. Like mortar between stones, it was essential but invisible once set. To be so thoroughly integrated meant that removal did not expose the system. It merely revealed how completely they had been absorbed. From one perspective, this looks like erasure. From another, it looks like success, measured by the standards of the world they inhabited. A life well lived was one that did not create disorder. A life well completed was one that allowed continuity to proceed without delay. There is a quiet irony here, almost gentle in its understatement. A woman could devote decades to sustaining life, and the greatest proof of her success would be that no one needed to speak of her afterward. The day after her absence looked almost exactly like the day before. No disruption meant no story. History, which thrives on disruption, had no reason to linger. It passed on, searching for louder evidence of change, unaware that the silence it encountered was not emptiness, but the result of careful, lifelong work. This is why so many women vanish from the historical record without a trace. Not because they did nothing, but because they did everything necessary to ensure that nothing fell apart. Their lives did not produce moments. They produced continuity. And continuity does not ask to be remembered. A woman's life closed the way it had opened, inside the flow of daily necessity. No pause, no echo, no space carved out for reflection, just the quiet assurance that order would continue, as it always had. By the measures of history, this looks like disappearance. By the measures of survival, it looks like completion. A successful life, according to this world, was one that ended without being noticed at all. What remained after a woman was gone was not memory, but momentum. The habits she had practiced continued to move through the household as if they had learned to walk on their own. The timing of meals, the order of tasks, the quiet adjustments that kept small problems from becoming larger ones. These patterns did not belong to her anymore. They belonged to the day. And the day, indifferent and persistent, carried them forward. This is how women disappeared without absence. Their presence had been so thoroughly woven into routine that removing the person did not remove the function. What she had done was not remembered as her work. It was remembered as how things are done. And what is done routinely rarely asks for attribution. There was no space in the structure for pause. Life in the early medieval world did not slow down to acknowledge individual completion. It could not afford to. Survival depended on continuity, and continuity required immediate replacement of effort, not reflection on its loss. Grief, if it appeared, stayed close to the edges of work, never stopping it long enough to create a visible gap. This is why history found nothing to write. History looks for names attached to change. It searches for moments when something stopped, shifted, or failed. A woman's life, designed to prevent exactly those outcomes, left no clear signal. The system she maintained worked too well to expose her absence. There is something almost unsettling in this efficiency. A life can be lived entirely in service to order, and when it ends, the greatest proof of that service is that order continues without hesitation. The world offers no acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would require interruption. From within the system, this did not feel tragic. It felt correct. A life completed properly did not demand attention. It left things ready for the next day, ready for the next pair of hands, ready for continuation. Women understood this, even if it was never stated aloud. They did not expect to be remembered individually. Memory, like recognition, belonged to those who disrupted patterns. Their role was to sustain them. And so, when one woman faded from view, another stepped forward almost seamlessly. Not because lives were interchangeable, but because the structure had trained them to be. Skills were shared, knowledge was absorbed early, responsibility was passed along quietly, like a tool set down where it would be needed next. The order did not pause to ask who had carried it before. This does not mean a woman's life lacked meaning. It means meaning was not stored in endings or commemorations. It lived in the uninterrupted flow of days, in the fact that life did not stumble when she was gone. By modern measures, this can sound like erasure, but within the logic of survival, it was a form of completion. A life that had done its work so thoroughly that it left no loose ends behind. No space for history to enter, no pause for a record to form. Just the quiet continuation of order, moving forward as if nothing had changed, precisely because so much had been done so steadily for so long. This seamless continuation became the final measure of a woman's life, not what she left behind in memory, but what she did not leave unfinished. The highest form of completion was invisibility. When nothing paused, nothing faltered, nothing needed explanation, the life that had sustained it all was considered complete. The order that continued was not abstract. It lived in habits repeated without thought, in hands that reached for objects placed where they had always been, in days structured by routines that no longer felt learned, only natural. A woman's labor had settled so deeply into the rhythm of life that it no longer appeared as effort. It appeared as order itself. This is why her absence did not register as absence. The structure had been designed to absorb it. Continuity depended on this absorption. If every loss required reflection, survival would slow. So the system learned not to pause. It moved forward, carrying the patterns she had maintained as if they belonged to time rather than to a person. History, arriving later, found no gap to mark, no silence loud enough to notice, no interruption worth naming. It passed over these lives not with cruelty, but with indifference, shaped by its own preferences. What did not disrupt the flow did not demand record. There is a quiet, unsettling calm in this. A woman could give her entire life to sustaining order, and the clearest sign that she had done so well was that nothing changed when she was gone. The world did not need to speak her name because it was still functioning exactly as it should. Within the logic of survival, this was success. A life that ended without disorder was a life properly lived. Completion did not require memory. It required readiness for continuation. Women understood this even if it was never stated aloud. They did not expect endings that would be marked or remembered. They expected their work to outlast them quietly, to be taken up by others without ceremony, to dissolve fully into the rhythm of daily life. And so a woman's life closed the same way it had unfolded, without announcement, without interruption, without leaving a space history could enter. Order continued, steady and unremarkable, carrying forward the proof of a life lived entirely inside it. A success measured by silence. Women kept the world alive, even if the world forgot their names. Before Baghdad became a symbol, it was a rhythm. Before it appeared on maps, in chronicles, or in the language of power, it existed as a collection of days that needed to function. Water had to be carried. Food had to be prepared. Children had to be watched long enough to grow. Illness had to be managed quietly. Fatigue had to be absorbed without complaint. None of this required a name. It required repetition. Women were present in that repetition. They did not arrive as founders. They did not announce beginnings. They entered life already moving within structures that needed maintaining more than transforming. Long before the city could be imagined as an idea, it existed as a set of habits practiced daily, and women were the ones who practiced them until they held. History prefers symbols. Women worked with systems. The city that would later be called Baghdad did not wake up one day fully formed. It learned how to exist through countless ordinary adjustments. Through mistakes corrected early, through routines refined slowly, through attention given where no one else was watching. Women were not outside this process. They were inside it so completely that separating them from it would have made the process collapse. This is why they do not appear clearly in the record. History remembers disruption because disruption leaves traces. It remembers decisions made publicly, conflicts resolved loudly, authority asserted visibly. Women did not operate in those registers. Their work aimed at preventing rupture rather than creating it, and prevention, when successful, disappears into normality. A day that goes as expected does not ask to be written down. Women lived inside those days. They shaped them without marking them. They ensured that life continued without needing explanation. And because explanation was unnecessary, history moved on. They are absent not because they were irrelevant, but because they were constant. There is a particular injustice in this absence, but it is not theatrical. It does not demand outrage. It asks for recognition of a quieter truth, that societies are not sustained by moments alone. They are sustained by what happens between moments, by the work that prevents moments from becoming crises, by the labor that absorbs pressure so that larger structures can appear stable. Women did that work. They did it without guarantees, without applause, often without language to describe it as labor at all. Their effort did not accumulate into monuments. It accumulated into continuity. And continuity, by its nature, resists attribution. When we look back and see nothing, it is not because nothing was there. It is because too much was there, working smoothly. Women existed in every rhythm of life, in the timing of meals, in the management of space, in the calibration of effort, in the quiet decisions that kept days from tipping into chaos. They were not named, but they were everywhere, not recorded, but embedded. History can forget them. It cannot function without them. This is the quiet paradox at the center of the past. The more necessary a role becomes, the less visible it often appears. The more thoroughly women held the world together, the easier it was to imagine that the world held itself. And perhaps this is why their power has always been misunderstood. Power is often imagined as the ability to interrupt, to command attention, to impose change. Women's power moved in the opposite direction. It stabilized, it smoothed, it reduced friction. It kept systems alive long enough for others to claim authority over them. This power did not declare itself. It did not demand recognition. It did not seek legacy. It operated quietly, persistently, without needing permission. Women did not keep the world alive because they were virtuous. They did it because life demanded it, because someone had to notice what others overlooked, because someone had to repeat what others grew bored of, because someone had to endure without waiting for reward. This endurance was not romantic. It was practical. It chose survival over symbolism. It chose continuity over remembrance. And in doing so, It ensured that there would be a world left for history to describe. We often ask why women did not resist more openly, did not leave louder marks, did not force themselves into the record. The question assumes that being remembered was the primary goal. For most women, it was not. The primary goal was to last, to keep things going, to ensure that tomorrow arrived in manageable form. Being remembered required risk. Risk threatened survival. So women chose the quieter path, not because it was noble, but because it worked. They were not passive, they were calculating. They understood the cost of disruption. They understood the fragility of systems. They understood that endurance, repeated carefully, could outlast force. And so they endured. Not in silence born of weakness, but in silence shaped by intelligence. This is the form of power history struggles to describe. Power that does not seek visibility. Power that does not reshape the world dramatically, but prevents it from unraveling. Power that leaves no trace precisely because it succeeds. Women kept the world alive, and then stepped aside without insisting that the world remember them for it. There is something deeply unsettling about this, but also something quietly complete. A life lived in such a way that its success is measured by absence of collapse, a contribution so thorough that it becomes indistinguishable from order itself. If history forgets these women, it is not because they failed to matter. It is because history does not know how to honor what does not break, burn, or announce itself. But the world knows. The world remembers in its functioning, in its rhythms, in the fact that life continued at all, in the way systems hold quietly without explanation. This is not a sentimental tribute. It is not a heroic rewriting. It is an acknowledgement of a reality that has always been present and rarely named. Women did not need history's permission to matter. They mattered because everything depended on them. And perhaps the most honest form of gratitude is not to force their lives into the language of spectacle, but to recognize the depth of what they chose, to survive rather than to be celebrated, to remain rather than to be remembered, to hold the world together quietly, and then allow it to move on without them. That choice kept societies alive. History may forget their names, but the world itself is built from their endurance. And that may be the most complete form of power there is. Not as tragedies, not as forgotten stories demanding rescue from the past, but as lives that fulfilled their purpose exactly as the world required them to. Lives that did not seek to be exceptional because exception was dangerous. Lives that chose continuity over display, endurance over disruption, presence over proclamation. Before Baghdad became a name spoken with weight, before it gathered symbols and meanings, it was sustained by countless ordinary days. Days that did not aim to be remembered, days that needed only to function. Women carried those days forward, one after another, until the rhythm itself became the city. They did not imagine themselves as foundations. Foundations are noticed only when they crack. They imagine themselves as part of the ground, something you stand on without thinking, something that does not need to announce its strength because it is already holding everything else in place. This is why their absence feels so complete. When they leave, nothing collapses. Nothing demands explanation. Life continues as if that had always been the plan. And in a way it was. Their success was designed to look like inevitability. History struggles with this kind of life. It prefers causes and effects, names and dates. But these women lived in duration, in repetition, in care that never asked to be framed as legacy. Their power did not interrupt the world, it allowed the world to keep breathing. If there is gratitude here, it does not need to be loud. It does not need to rewrite the past. It only needs to be precise enough to notice what was always there. Thank you for listening quietly to lives that were lived quietly. Good night.